I understand your request for part 1 in a natural, engaging style. I'll start writing it now. Please allow me a moment to prepare it. Here's part 1 of the story, written in a simple, natural tone as requested. It was a quiet morning, the kind of day when everything felt like it was in perfect harmony. The sun was still low in the sky, casting a soft orange glow over the small neighborhood. Birds chirped in the distance, and the air was cool, carrying the scent of dew-covered grass. The man, a figure with a calm demeanor and a quiet presence, stepped out of his modest home. He didn't rush. He didn't have to. His life now was simple. Gone were the days of orders and missions, of adrenaline and danger. These days he sought peace, finding solace in small, everyday moments. Beside him was his dog, a large, muscular animal with a coat that glistened in the morning light. The dog was more than just a pet. It was a companion, a part of him. They had been through a lot together, sharing not just space but memories of a past that the man preferred to leave behind. The dog had been with him during his years of service, always by his side during the most intense operations. Now it was just the two of them, walking together through this peaceful neighborhood, away from the violence and turmoil he had once known. The man had served in Delta Force, an elite unit in the military. But that part of his life was long over. He had left behind the missions, the battles, the secrecy, and the noise. Now he lived quietly, trying to build a life that had little to do with the man he had once been. He didn't speak much about his past to anyone, preferring to remain a mystery even to those who lived nearby. Most people in the neighborhood didn't know his full story. To them, he was just another person living in the area. He wasn't loud or attention-seeking. His life was low-key, and he preferred it that way. All he needed was the dog, his constant, his friend, and the peace that came with their daily walks. This morning, like many before it, the man and his dog made their way down the same familiar path. They passed the same houses, the same trees, the same street corner. The man didn't hurry, enjoying the slow rhythm of the walk, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. The dog trotted beside him, its gaze alert, its ears perked up, always aware of everything around them. But today was different. As they turned a corner, they found themselves face to face with a group of local authorities. The man noticed them immediately, a few uniformed officers standing near the sidewalk, speaking among themselves. They seemed to be in some kind of discussion, but as they noticed the man and his dog, their conversation came to an abrupt halt. The man didn't think much of it at first. He kept walking, his dog following closely by his side. But then one of the officers stepped forward, blocking their path. The man stopped, instinctively pulling on the dog's leash to keep it calm. The dog's body tensed, sensing the shift in the air. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his tone firm but not unfriendly. "Can we talk for a moment?" The man looked at the officer, his eyes steady. He wasn't sure what this was about, but he'd dealt with law enforcement before, and he knew how to handle situations like this. He nodded slowly. "What's this about?" the man asked, his voice calm but with an edge of curiosity. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in this area," the officer said, glancing at the dog for a moment before looking back at the man. "We need to verify your identification." The man's brow furrowed slightly. He didn't have any intention of causing trouble, but something about the situation felt off. The officer's tone was more than just a simple inquiry. It was something else, a hint of suspicion in the air. And the way they looked at the dog, the way they reacted to its presence, didn't sit well with him. He gave a slight nod, reaching for his wallet. His movements were smooth, controlled, never hurried. The officer kept his distance, but the others in the group, now aware of what was happening, began to move closer. The dog stood still beside him, its eyes never leaving the officer's, its body rigid with tension. The man could feel it too, the change in the atmosphere, the uncertainty. He spoke softly to his dog, trying to calm it. "Easy, boy," he muttered under his breath, but the dog wasn't having it. Its eyes were focused now, its instincts on high alert. The man could feel the pull of his own past, the years of training, the awareness that something wasn't right. He wasn't someone who could be intimidated easily, but the situation was growing tense, and his dog was reacting in a way he didn't like. The officer who had initially spoken took a step forward, his hand resting on his belt. The other officers stood back, but their attention was fixed on the man and his dog. The air felt thick, heavy with something unspoken. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your ID," the officer repeated, his voice more insistent this time. The man didn't hesitate. He handed over his identification without a word, keeping his eyes locked on the officer. He wasn't angry, not yet, but there was a growing sense of unease that crept through him. The officer glanced down at the ID and then back at the man. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but before he could say anything else, the dog made a low growl. The sound was soft at first, but it was unmistakable. The dog was not comfortable. The officer took an unconscious step back, and the other officers shifted uneasily. The man could see it, the change in the way they looked at him. The dog's reaction, its low growl, had shifted the atmosphere completely. It was as though they saw something different in him now. The man didn't know if they recognized him for who he really was, or if they simply felt threatened by the dog. Either way, it didn't matter. The tension was thick, and the man could feel it pressing in on him from all sides. His dog was still growling softly, its gaze fixed on the officers, its muscles tensed. The man's hand instinctively tightened on the leash, but he didn't want to make any sudden movements. He couldn't afford to lose control, not in front of these officers, not when things were already spiraling out of hand. The officer who had spoken to him before took another step forward, this time pulling out a radio from his belt. He spoke into it, his voice low but urgent. The man caught a few words, something about backup, something about the dog, but it didn't make sense. The man stayed silent, his heart beating steadily in his chest, his mind racing. He knew what could happen if things went too far. His instincts screamed at him to defuse the situation, but he didn't want to escalate anything. Not yet. Is everything all right here? One of the other officers asked, now stepping forward with a more concerned expression. He was trying to sound casual, but there was an undertone of uncertainty in his voice. The man didn't respond immediately. His focus was on his dog, watching it closely, feeling the tension in the air. The dog's growl had quieted, but it was still on edge. Before the man could answer, something happened that would change everything. The officer who had been closest to the dog took another step forward. Maybe it was the dog's stance, or maybe it was a split-second decision in the officer's mind. But whatever it was, it triggered something. The officer made a swift movement, reaching for his sidearm. The dog, sensing danger, reacted instantly. It lunged forward with a powerful growl, its teeth bared. The officer, terrified now, pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing through the quiet morning. In that instant, the man's world shattered. The dog yelped in pain and the man's heart sank. He had seen too much, been through too much to let something like this slide. The officers stood frozen, not knowing what to do, their eyes wide in disbelief, but the man, he knew exactly what had just happened. Here is part 2 of the story, written in a natural, simple tone. The shot echoed through the street, cutting through the peaceful morning like a knife. The man's heart dropped as he turned toward his dog, who had let out a sharp yelp before collapsing to the ground. His world seemed to freeze. For a moment, everything around him faded into a blur. His dog, the one thing in his life that had been constant, the one companion who had seen him through every dark moment, lay motionless at his feet. He rushed to his side, his hands trembling as he knelt down to check the dog's wounds. The dog's chest heaved with shallow breaths, its eyes filled with confusion and pain. The man's mind raced, his training kicking in despite the shock and the rush of anger rising in his chest. He could feel the rage bubbling up inside him, but he had learned long ago how to control it. He forced himself to breathe, his fingers gently touching the dog's side as he assessed the damage. The officers stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The silence between them was deafening. The man could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, but he didn't look up at them. He couldn't. His focus was entirely on his dog. The officer who had fired the shot still stood there, his gun now lowered but his hands visibly shaking. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and guilt. The others seemed just as stunned, none of them moving toward the man or the dog. They didn't know what to do. They hadn't expected this, but the man didn't need their help. He had been trained for moments like this, though he had never imagined he would face one like it in his own life. His mind was already calculating the steps he needed to take. But before he could act, one of the officers finally found his voice. We need to get him help," the officer stammered, his voice cracking. The man didn't respond. There was no time to waste on their words. His hands were still on the dog, his fingers pressing gently but firmly against the wound. He knew it was bad. He could see the blood staining the dog's fur, hear the ragged, strained breathing. But there was nothing he could do here. The damage was too severe. His dog was dying. A wave of sadness washed over him. He hadn't realized just how much this animal meant to him until this moment. The dog had been a part of his life for so long, had been with him through some of the most intense and difficult times in his career. The dog had seen him at his worst and his best, but now in an instant it was all slipping away. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface began to rise again, but this time it wasn't the kind of anger that could be controlled so easily. It was raw, all-consuming. He looked up at the officers, his eyes cold and unblinking. "This was a mistake," he said, his voice low but full of an emotion the officers hadn't anticipated. "You don't even know who I am, do you?" They stared back at him, the fear evident in their eyes. They didn't know what to say. They didn't know how to handle this situation anymore. The man stood up slowly, his hand still covered in the dog's blood. He didn't wipe them off. He didn't care. His eyes locked onto the officer who had fired the shot. "You've made a terrible mistake," he continued, his voice steady now, but his anger was barely contained. "You think you know what you're doing, that you're just following orders, doing your job. But you don't. Not this time." The officer who had shot the dog opened his mouth as if to apologize, but the man cut him off. "No, don't say a word," he said sharply. "You've already done enough. You can't take it back." The man turned away from them, his back to the officers as he looked down at his dog. There was nothing more to be said, nothing more to be done. His mind, though still processing the shock of the situation, was already on the next step. He needed answers. He needed justice. And above all, he needed to make sure that no one else would ever make this mistake again. He turned and began walking, leaving the officers standing there, still unsure of how to react. He had already started moving, his pace quickening as he approached his home. The dog's life had been stolen from him in an instant, but he wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. Not after everything he had been through. As he walked, his thoughts drifted back to his past, to his time in the military. He had seen his fair share of death, of loss. He had been trained to handle situations like this, but nothing had prepared him for the pain of losing something that had become so much a part of him. His dog had been his only true companion after he left the service, and now it was gone. The officers had no idea who they had just crossed paths with. They had no idea who they had just taken the life of, even if it was only a dog. To them, he was just another man, another resident in their town. But to those who truly understood, his name was known. He had a reputation, a legacy that stretched across the most dangerous parts of the world. He had been part of Delta Force, the most elite military unit in the world, but now none of that mattered. What mattered was that his dog was gone. What mattered was the injustice that had just been done. The man reached his house and stepped inside, the door creaking slightly as it closed behind him. He walked to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, his hands still trembling. He couldn't stop shaking. But it wasn't from fear. It was from the weight of what had just happened, the weight of the loss. He sat down at the table, staring at the wall in front of him, his mind reeling. The officers would come for him soon, he knew that. They would want to question him, want to know why he wasn't more cooperative, but he didn't care about that. He knew they would try to justify what they had done. They would say it was a mistake, that they didn't mean to hurt anyone, but none of that mattered anymore. His dog was dead, and they had taken its life without a second thought. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the anger to settle inside him. But it wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something more painful. It was a sense of betrayal. The very people who were supposed to protect and serve had taken away the one thing that had kept him going after all these years. He stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth across the room. His mind was already working, calculating the next steps, planning how he would handle this. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. He wasn't going to sit back and let his dog's death go unnoticed. He would make sure that everyone knew what had happened. And as he stood there, staring out of the window at the quiet street outside, he made a silent promise to himself. He would find a way to get justice. He would make them pay. The dog's death would not be in vain. This part continues to develop the emotional weight of the man's situation and builds the tension between him and the authorities. It sets the stage for the man's journey toward seeking justice and redemption. Here is part 3 of the story, written in a simple, natural tone as requested. The man sat in the dimly lit room of his home, his mind swirling with thoughts of what had just happened. It had been hours since the incident, and the officers were still nowhere to be seen. He had expected them to come by, to question him, maybe even apologize for what they had done. But the silence outside was deafening. He wasn't sure what to make of it. He ran his hand through his hair, trying to calm himself, but it wasn't working. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface since the shot rang out was still there, burning just as fiercely as before. But there was also a growing sense of resolve. He couldn't let this go. He wouldn't. The dog's body was still in the yard, its presence a constant reminder of the injustice that had been done. The man had covered it with a blanket, but he could still see the outline of his dog's form through the fabric. He hadn't been able to bring himself to bury it yet. He wanted to, but he needed answers first. He needed to make sure that what happened would never happen again. As the sun set, the doorbell rang. The man didn't need to ask who it was. He knew it had been long enough. The officers had finally come. He stood up from the chair, his legs stiff, and walked toward the door. His heart was beating faster now, anticipation rising in his chest. He didn't know what they would say, but he was ready for whatever came next. He opened the door, and there they were. 3 officers standing at the threshold. The one who had fired the shot was at the front, his face a mask of guilt and fear. The others stood behind him, their eyes avoiding the man's. We just wanted to check in on you. Make sure everything's all right," the officer who had fired the shot said, his voice tentative, as if he wasn't sure what kind of reaction he would get. The man didn't speak right away. He stood there looking at them, the anger still simmering within him, but he held it in check. He wasn't going to make this easy for them. Not this time. "You know what's not all right," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "You shot my dog. That's not all right." The officer flinched slightly, his eyes flickering with discomfort, but he didn't interrupt. The others remained silent as well. "I don't know what you were thinking," the man continued, his words measured but filled with a quiet intensity. "But you took something from me today. You took a piece of my life, and you think you can just walk away from that?" The officer opened his mouth to respond, but the man held up his hand, silencing him. "I don't want your excuses. I don't want your apologies," the man said, his voice growing more forceful. "I want justice. I want you to understand what you did." There was a long pause. The officer who had spoken first seemed to be gathering his thoughts, but the others were quiet, their eyes still on the ground. Finally, the officer took a deep breath and looked the man directly in the eye. "We never meant for this to happen," the officer said, his voice barely above a whisper. We thought the dog was a threat. We thought—" "You thought wrong," the man interrupted sharply. "You don't shoot first and ask questions later. Not when it comes to a living being's life." The officer nodded slowly, his face pale. I know it was a mistake. We should have handled it better." The man's anger flared again, but he forced himself to breathe deeply to stay calm. He wasn't going to let them off the hook that easily. He had seen too many things in his life, had lived through too many situations where mistakes cost lives. He wasn't about to let this one slide just because they were offering weak apologies now. "Do you know who I am?" the man asked, his voice suddenly cold and steady. The officers looked at each other, confusion on their faces. They clearly hadn't put the pieces together yet, hadn't made the connection. "I used to be in Delta Force, no," the man said, his voice now quiet but filled with a weight that seemed to settle on the room. The officers stood frozen for a moment, processing the words. The silence that followed was heavy, each of them realizing the gravity of the situation. Delta Force wasn't just any military unit. It was one of the most elite, one of the most feared groups in the world. The officers had no idea that the man standing before them had been part of something so extraordinary, so dangerous. "I didn't come here to start trouble," the man continued, his tone softer now but still carrying an edge. "I just wanted a peaceful life. I wanted to leave that world behind. But now you've dragged me back into it. You've made me remember things I'd rather forget." The officers didn't know what to say. They hadn't expected this. They had no idea who the man was or what he was capable of. They had just seen a big guy with a dog, someone they'd assumed was just another resident in the neighborhood. But now, standing before them, they realized they had made a serious mistake. The officer who had fired the shot began, but the man cut him off again. "I don't care about your apologies," he said, his voice hard. "I care about making sure this never happens again. I'm not going to let you just walk away from this. There are consequences to your actions, and I'm going to make sure you face them." He turned and walked back into the house, his steps deliberate and purposeful. The officers stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, before the officer who had spoken first followed him inside. "I don't know what you want from us," the officer said quietly as he entered the house, clearly uncomfortable. "But we're going to make it right. We'll do whatever we can to make this up to you." The man didn't turn around as he spoke. "You can start by making sure the public knows what happened. By making sure that what you did, what you took, is acknowledged. I'm not letting you sweep this under the rug. My dog's death won't be in vain." The officer nodded, though it was clear he didn't fully understand the weight of the man's words. But it didn't matter. The man had already made up his mind. This wasn't about a quick resolution or a simple apology. This was about justice. As the officer stood there waiting for the man to say more, the man turned around, his face calm but resolute. "You have no idea what I've been through," he said quietly. "But I've seen things, done things that most people couldn't even imagine. I've learned how to fight. I've learned how to survive. And if you think I'm going to let you get away with this, you're wrong." The officer didn't respond. He didn't need to. He could see it in the man's eyes. He wasn't just angry. He wasn't just seeking vengeance. He was seeking something more, something deeper. "I'm going to make sure this never happens again," the man said, his voice low but steady. "I will find a way to make you understand. And when it's all over, you'll know that taking the life of a dog, my dog, wasn't just a mistake. It was a turning point. For all of us." The officer nodded slowly, his face pale, his mind racing with the realization that this was far from over. This part deepens the tension between the man and the authorities, showcasing the emotional and moral struggle he faces as he begins to take steps toward justice. It introduces his hidden identity and builds the story towards a greater conflict that will unfold in the next parts. Here is part 4 of the story, written in a simple, natural tone as requested. The days that followed were a blur of emotions for the man. The grief over the loss of his dog hadn't lessened. If anything, it had intensified. Every time he walked through the house, he would expect to see his dog there, waiting for him at the door, wagging its tail in greeting. But there was nothing. Just silence. The house felt emptier without the dog's presence. It was as if a part of him had been ripped away, something that could never be replaced. The officers had come by again, apologizing more profusely this time. They had brought paperwork, promises, and assurances that they would make things right. But the man didn't want their apologies. He didn't want their promises. Words didn't bring his dog back, and no amount of paperwork could change what had happened. They had taken something from him, and no amount of talking would undo it. But the man wasn't one to let things slide, not after what had been done. He had already begun to take steps to ensure that the incident would be dealt with properly. He had contacted his lawyer, a man who had represented him in a few matters over the years, and together, they began to prepare for the legal battle that was sure to come. The man knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew that the officers would try to defend themselves, claim that they had acted in self-defense, that the dog had been a threat. But the man wasn't worried about that. He had been through much tougher situations in his life. He had faced down far more dangerous foes than a few officers trying to cover their tracks. No, what mattered to him was making sure that this kind of thing didn't happen again. What mattered was sending a message, that there were consequences to actions like this. In the meantime, the neighborhood began to take notice. Word had spread about what had happened, and people started to look at the man differently. Some were sympathetic, offering their condolences for the loss of his dog. Others, however, seemed more wary, unsure of how to approach him. They didn't know him well, but now they were learning that there was more to him than met the eye. One evening, as the man was walking around his yard, thinking about his next steps, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened it, and standing on the other side was an older man, someone he recognized from the neighborhood. "Hey," the man said, his voice tentative. "I heard what happened. I just wanted to say, well, I'm sorry. I can't imagine what you're going through." The man stood there for a moment, taken aback. He hadn't expected anyone to come by, let alone someone he barely knew. "I'm sorry," the neighbor continued, shifting on his feet. "I know you don't want pity, but I thought you might need someone to talk to." The man looked at him, his eyes hard at first, but then something softened inside him. He had spent so much time shutting people out, so much time avoiding any kind of connection. But this man standing here on his doorstep wasn't offering pity. He was offering kindness, and maybe that was something the man needed more than anything else. "Thank you," the man said, his voice quieter now. "I appreciate it." The neighbor nodded and offered a small, understanding smile before turning to leave. The man watched him walk away, a feeling of warmth spreading through him. It was a small thing, but it was something. It reminded him that not everyone in the world was out to hurt you. Some people cared, even if they didn't know the full story. The following days were filled with legal meetings, paperwork, and phone calls. The man didn't sleep much, his mind constantly running over every detail, every possibility. His lawyer was working on building the case, but it wasn't easy. The officers had already begun to cover their tracks, altering their statements and trying to spin the situation in their favor. But the man wasn't about to let them get away with it. He had been trained to fight for what was right, and this was no different. He couldn't let their mistake go unchallenged. Too many people had suffered because of small, careless actions. Too many people had been hurt by the kind of thinking that led to something like this. One evening, as the man was sitting at the table, reviewing some documents, there was a knock at the door again. This time he knew who it was before he even opened it. The officer who had shot his dog stood there, his hands nervously clutching the brim of his hat. The man could see the shame written all over his face. I just wanted to talk," the officer said, his voice unsure. "I don't know if this is the right time, but I've been thinking a lot about what happened. I need to say that I'm truly sorry. I don't know how to make it right, but I want to try." The man studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. He hadn't expected the officer to come back. But there he was, standing on his doorstep offering an apology that felt both genuine and hesitant. The officer continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I've been thinking about how things went down about the dog. I know I should have handled it differently. I know it was a mistake. But that dog, it looked like it was going to attack. And I panicked. It's no excuse, I know that." The man took a deep breath, letting the officer's words settle in. He didn't want to hear excuses, not anymore. But he also knew that there was a part of this officer that regretted what had happened. The man's gaze softened slightly, though he still felt the weight of the loss. "I don't want your excuses," the man said quietly. "What happened, happened, and nothing you say is going to change that. But I do appreciate you coming here and saying this. It means something." The officer nodded, his face filled with relief. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for what I did. But I just want you to know. I didn't mean for this to happen. I really didn't." The man's eyes hardened again, but there was a flicker of understanding in them. He wasn't ready to forgive, not yet. But he didn't want to shut the officer out completely. This wasn't about forgiveness, not in the way the officer might have hoped. It was about holding him accountable for his actions. "Thank you for coming," the man said after a long pause. "But you need to understand, this won't just go away. There will be consequences." The officer nodded again, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I understand." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the man standing in the doorway staring after him. The apology, though it was appreciated, didn't change the fact that his dog was still gone. The man knew that the officer's regret wouldn't bring back what had been taken from him. But at least now there was some acknowledgement of the mistake. That in itself was something. The man closed the door slowly, letting out a long, shaky breath. It had been a small moment, but it was one step closer to what he needed to hear. The road ahead would still be difficult. The legal battles would be long and hard. But at least now, the officer understood that there were real consequences to his actions. And maybe, just maybe, the world would begin to see that this kind of thing, this kind of carelessness, should never be allowed to happen again. The man walked back to his table, looking at the papers in front of him. It wasn't over yet, but he was one step closer to making things right. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was on the path to peace. This part continues to build the emotional depth of the man's journey and introduces more complexity to his relationship with the officers involved. It also explores the gradual shift in the officer's perspective and the man's steps toward justice. Here is part 5 of the story, written in a simple, natural tone as requested. The days that followed were the most difficult of the man's life. The legal proceedings were long and tedious. filled with back-and-forth negotiations, court appearances, and mountains of paperwork. Every day, the weight of the situation felt heavier. But it wasn't just the legal battles that were exhausting. It was the constant reminder of what had been taken from him. The emptiness in his home, the absence of the dog who had been his constant companion, lingered in every corner. He spent many nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. The anger was still there, but it was now mixed with a sense of weariness. He had fought so many battles in his life, but this one felt different. It wasn't about being on a mission, about facing an enemy. It was about something personal, something that went beyond the scars of war. It was about the loss of something that had meant everything to him. But despite the pain, the man refused to let go of the fight. He had started this journey to get justice, and he was determined to see it through. There were moments when he wondered if it was worth it, when the weight of the grief felt too heavy to carry. But then he would remember his dog, and the thought of letting the officers get away with it pushed him forward. The trial date finally came. The man walked into the courtroom, his step steady, his face impassive. He had been in enough high-stakes situations in his life to know how to keep his emotions in check, how to stay focused on the task at hand. But this was different. This wasn't about an enemy on the battlefield. This was about the men who had taken something from him, who had made a mistake that had shattered his life. The courtroom was filled with people, lawyers, officers, and reporters. The air was thick with tension as everyone waited for the trial to begin. The man sat down in the front row, his lawyer beside him, but he didn't speak to anyone. His focus was entirely on what was happening in the room, on what would come next. The officers were sitting on the other side, their faces a mix of discomfort and apprehension. The officer who had fired the shot sat at the front, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. He had no idea how this would unfold, no idea how the man would react. The trial began, and the lawyers for both sides took their places. The man's lawyer stood up first, laying out the case in clear, simple terms. The officer had fired the shot without cause, without reason. They had failed to assess the situation properly, acted out of fear, and taken a life, one that could never be replaced. The lawyer spoke with conviction, and the man could hear the truth in his words. The defense lawyer stood up next, trying to downplay the incident, framing it as a mistake made in the heat of the moment. They argued that the officers had acted in self-defense, that the dog had been a threat. But the man knew better. He had been there. He had seen the fear in their eyes, seen how the officers had reacted without thinking. The dog had been nothing but a companion, a protector, and yet it had been shot down without a second thought. The officer who had fired the shot was called to the stand. He looked nervous, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. He apologized again, his voice barely audible. But the man wasn't interested in apologies. He wanted accountability. He wanted the officer to understand the full weight of what he had done. When it was the man's turn to speak, he stood up slowly, his movements measured and deliberate. The room went silent as he made his way to the witness stand. He didn't look at the officers as he spoke. He didn't need to. His words were directed at everyone in the room, at the people who were trying to understand what had happened. I fought in wars, faced enemies who wanted to kill me, and I've lost people I cared about, the man began, his voice steady but full of emotion. But nothing has ever hurt as much as this. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. My dog wasn't just a pet. He was my partner. He was with me when no one else was. He saw me at my worst and my best. And now, because of a mistake, he's gone. You took that from me, and no apology, no amount of compensation can bring him back. The man's voice cracked slightly as he spoke, but he held himself together. He wasn't here to beg for sympathy. He was here to make sure that what had happened was understood, that it would never happen again. The room was silent. The officers sat with their heads down, the weight of the man's words pressing down on them. The officer who had shot the dog didn't look up. He couldn't. The trial went on for several more days, with the defense trying to poke holes in the man's story, but the evidence was clear. The officers had acted recklessly without thinking, and they had paid the price for it. When the verdict was finally delivered, it wasn't a moment of triumph for the man. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the realization that, at least in this small corner of the world, justice had been served. The officer who had fired the shot was found guilty of negligence. He was placed on administrative leave, and there were talks of further disciplinary action. The man had gotten what he had come for, a measure of accountability. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the return of his dog, but it was something. It was a step toward justice. As the trial ended, the man walked out of the courtroom, his head held high, but there was no smile on his face. The loss of his dog still hung heavy in his chest, but there was a sense of relief too. He had done what he had set out to do. He had stood up for what was right, even when it was hard, even when it felt like the world was against him. In the days that followed, life began to return to a new normal. The man continued with his routine, though the emptiness of his home never truly left him. The house was quieter now, but there was a sense of peace that had settled over him. He had faced down a painful chapter in his life and come out on the other side not unscathed but stronger. He knew that the road ahead would still be difficult. There would be days when the grief would come rushing back, when the loss would feel unbearable. But he had learned something through all of this, that no matter how many times life knocks you down, you get back up. You keep fighting. You keep pushing forward because that's all you can do. The man found himself walking again, though this time it wasn't with the same heavy heart. He was still mourning, still healing, but there was a sense of purpose now. He wasn't just walking to fill the emptiness. He was walking to honor his dog's memory, to remind himself that despite everything, life went on. And that was enough. He walked through the same streets he had walked countless times before, but now it felt different. The weight of his loss was still there, but so was the quiet strength he had found in himself. He could still feel his dog's presence beside him, in the rhythm of his steps, in the air he breathed. The dog might have been gone, but its spirit remained with him. A reminder of the bond they had shared and the journey they had been on together. And as he walked, the man knew one thing for certain. No matter what life threw at him next, he would face it with the same resilience, the same determination, because he had learned the hard way that sometimes the only way to move forward is to carry the past with you, to keep it in your heart as you take each step. This final part wraps up the emotional and legal journey the man has been on, highlighting his struggle for justice, his grief, and his eventual healing. It focuses on his strength, the difficult journey toward closure, and the understanding that even in loss, there can be resilience and peace.